All right, let's talk about types and causes of inflation. We're going to talk about creeping, chronic, and hyperinflation today. Creeping inflation is when inflation is low and slow. This is what we want. Typically, it's between 1% and 3% per year for a long period of time. And you can see that highlighted in the graphic right through here. Um, this this is great. When you have creeping inflation, it doesn't cause major problems. Everything's pretty steady and predictable, meaning it's easy to plan your budgets as a government and a business. And even as a household, you know what prices are going to be. You can plan your home budget as well. Chronic inflation is when inflation rises between 5 and 15% per year for a long period of time. And here you're going to be able to see that in the late 70s and early 80s. This it becomes difficult in an economy. You can't predict what costs are going to be in the future. Businesses aren't sure what investments they should be making. Should they be buying new capital goods or whatnot? Because prices are changing pretty rapidly. And then hyperinflation is when inflation's out of control, typically over 100% per year, and it can definitely lead to economic chaos. Best example historically we have is Germany in the early 1920s. After World War One, they owed 132 million marks, which is about $32 billion, in reparations. Um, in current terms, 32 billion. After World War One, and they didn't have that. They couldn't raise it in taxes, so they just started running printing press and printing money. Well, the more money you put in the economy, the higher the prices are going to get. So they had inflation that went from 5,470% to 1.3 trillion percent. At the end of the year, a dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Egg cost 80 billion marks. Can you imagine that? Going to the store and be like, hey, can I get one egg? And they're like, $80 billion. Um, at this point, they didn't even know. When you go to the store and they say $80 billion, you go, okay. And you're not sure if that's good or not because prices are changing so rapidly. An unskilled worker was paid 531 million marks a week. Um, do you imagine that? $531 million a week? It was impossible to keep track of prices. They carried money around in wheelbarrows and whatnot. They started weighing it because they didn't even have the time to count it. People used it as wallpaper and they burned it to heat their homes because that was cheaper than trying to buy firewood. Some factories, workers were paid 3 times a day. Their wives would come and take the money and run to the store and try to grab anything they could and buy it before the prices went up later in the day. And what happens when you have this sort of hyperinflation is the world kind of reverts back to barter. And nobody really knows what the value of anything is. So they just start using exchange of goods for goods. In November 1923, the German government had to get rid of the marks and create a new currency. And they took 1 trillion mark for uh, one new mark. Other examples of hyperinflation in Nicaragua between 1986 and 1991, they had 11 billion percent. Uh, in Serbia, they had 156 million percent in the 90s. And then good old Zimbabwe, they had inflation of 24,411% in 2007. And by November 2008, it was 89.7 sextillion percent. So that's like prices doubling every day. So imagine that. Say you go to, I don't know, McDonald's today, right? And you buy a meal that costs $5. Tomorrow it would be $10. The next day, $20. The third day, $40. Then $80. Then $160. And a week from now, we're looking at $320 for that meal. It's hard to even imagine. Um, Here's some other examples from Latin America and Eastern Europe. The impact of hyperinflation is really hard on output and employment. Prices go up so sharply, people think prices are going to rise even quicker, and they don't they don't know what to do. Business owners don't know what to charge, customers don't know what to pay, and then you get to a point where people want to be paid in output because the output has value and the money doesn't. So money really becomes worthless. Um, and you see people tend to try to keep their savings not in money, but in actual commodities like jewels and gold and things that have value. The economy can be thrown into chaos. It is economic chaos, it can be social and political chaos as well. So, we talked about Arthur Okun and his Okun's Law, but he also created what's called the Misery Index. Um, this is the sum of monthly inflation and unemployment rates. One of the fun things people look at it is presidents. What is the unemployment rate and the inflation rate? And that's the Misery Index. At this point in time, uh, it was 6.46. It's a little bit lower because our unemployment is lower now. And what is the economic issue that all these presidents were facing during their time? And then it's also used to look at how presidents perform. What was the change in the Misery Index from the beginning of their presidency to the end? So you can see these things during Nixon's presidency got worse. Here, during all the following Bush, Kennedy, Obama, Clinton, Ford, Reagan, Truman, uh, the misery index was lower at the end of their time in office rather than the beginning. So let's talk about the causes of inflation and distinguish the two: demand pull and cost push. So, nearly all the prices in the economy are set by supply and demand. We know that. So, when we're seeing this increase in prices, we try to narrow down, all right, is this coming from supply or is it coming from demand? So, demand pull inflation is inflation that comes from too much demand. It's typically said too much money chasing too few goods. This is when the demand for products is higher than our ability to produce the products. So here's the example: $2.75 because it starts raining and that increases demand, so it increases the prices. So when inflation is rapid and sustained, it's typically, in terms of demand pull, an overissuance of money by the Federal Reserve. They put too much money into the economy. There's not enough capacity to produce that many goods, and that competition to buy the goods pushes the price upward. Cost push inflation comes from the supply side. This is prices going up because it becomes more expensive to produce the goods and services. Higher production costs like wages, raw materials, or energy. Higher costs get passed on to consumers, and that becomes higher prices. A theory of cost push inflation basically says as per unit production cost rises, we're going to see inflation. So total input cost divided by units of output. If our per unit production cost goes up, we're going to see cost push inflation. There are two sources of cost push inflation. First one is wage push. This is when wage gains are excessive. And we've talked about this before. If our economy was to decide, all right, we're going to jump from a $9 minimum wage to a $15 minimum wage, we talked about how it's going to cause inflation. Because when we get that large jump, it gets more expensive for producers to produce, and they're going to eventually raise their prices to help pay for it. And it goes into the wage price spiral. Workers get a pay raise to compensate them because there's inflation. Then that pushes prices up. Prices are more expensive, so we got to pay our workers more. We pay them more. That's going to make prices go up, and we just kind of spiral out of control here. The second one is the supply shock variant. This is a major source of cost push inflation since the 1960s. It's supply shocks. These are sudden, unanticipated increase in the cost of raw materials. Okay, so here, this is looking at the price of a barrel of oil. That tends to be one that causes some issues. So the example here is oil prices went way up between 1973 and 1974, and then again in 1979 through 1980. And this caused huge inflation. GDP was falling, unemployment was going up, and it was causing inflation. There's a couple examples you can read about. Demand pull versus cost push inflation is one distinction that we need to talk about. Um, Demand pull is going to continue as long as there is excess spending. And in order to deal with this, we want uh, we want demand to fall, and typically the government's going to have to jump in to deal with demand pull inflation. Cost push is self-limiting and will die out by itself. When per unit production costs increase, it reduces supply. And as supply decreases, it's going to lower our output and employment, and that will decrease per unit production cost increases. Less people are working. Workers are then willing to work for less. That keeps resource price down, and it kind of dies out. The hard part is figuring out, is this cost push inflation or demand pull inflation? And typically, governments are slow to act unless they can figure out the root cause, whether it's demand pull or cost push. If it's demand pull in origin, they might take action, whether fiscal or monetary policy, to deal with it. But if it's cost push, if they take action, it